off and get going. All right, it's officially 2 o'clock Eastern, so let's do this. Welcome everybody. Like I was just saying before we started recording, this is the third Tuesday of every month, which means it is promo standards education time. So what our goal is to bring 12 sessions a year, highlighting both the technical integration side, the community side of promo standards, and the membership aspects as well. So this year, this is the first Zoom one we've done this year after some in-person ones. Our goal is to have a different presenter every month, bring a different perspective to promo standards, listen to other people other than myself, banter for an hour or however long Jay decides to go today. Hopefully it's not longer than an hour. But a few housekeeping things before we get going with the Jay's awesome presentation. Amy posted some things in the, hopefully all of you are in Slack. If you're members, you're in Slack. You should be. If not, reach out to Jessica. Amy posted a few things in Slack yesterday that we want to kind of briefly cover. We're looking to kick off a promo standards mentorship program, just be able to allow a more formal way for people to connect. We're really trying to beta this program with Promo Kitchen, another non-for-profit in the industry, who runs a pretty awesome promo mentorship program. So if you want to get involved and kind of help us navigate those waters, our goal is to use the next 6 to 9 months and put together something pretty cool and then roll it out to the entire promo standards community. So that's in Slack. We're just started to kick off the virtual hackathon work group. So Becky is going to lead that up this year. Becky Ellis, she's in Slack. So hit her up if you're interested. Basically, we just need a group of volunteers to figure out how the thing's going to run. I think we learned last year what does, what doesn't work, what works well. We're going to do a virtual component, and then we're going to do an in-person component at the Tech Summit next year. So it'll be pretty awesome. Look forward to more details, but if you want to get involved in the planning of that, now's your opportunity. Hit it, Becky. We got a month or so to kind of get that going. Our AV crew from the Tech Summit put together a pretty cool video. Check that out. It's also in the Slack general channel. It's about 1.5 minutes. Good promo. It obviously ends with the location and dates for next year's Tech Summit. Get that going. What else? Probably in mid-May, we're going to start the holiday 8 to 9 month process for planning next year's Tech Summit. So keep an eye out for that. And what do we have for future education sessions? I'll hit this on the back side of Jay's presentation. Next month, we're going to, Steve Stanley is going to walk through OSN 2.0. The presentation I did last year sometime. There's been some updates after the community review. There's this whole, dev cycle between the alphas, the beta implementers. The community review actually found a few fixes to the OSN 2.0, but we're going to drop that hammer hopefully here in the next few days. And then Steve Stanley from the standards committee is going to walk through that for us. We have some pretty cool education sessions planned out, so stay tuned. We'll try to announce them and get you about a month lead time, but just mark your calendar, third Tuesday every month, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, however you want to work that out. All right, I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to introduce the chair of the Best Practices Committee. So for those of you who don't know, about 2.5 years ago, Promo Standards formed a Best Practices Committee because we realized that while there is a standards committee that's doing that heavy lift there, we needed to provide guidance to the greater community. So what we did is we formed a Best Practices Committee that goes out and really, helps on the what's and whys and wheres of the promo standards implementations themselves. So Jay has taken over that committee this year and leads up a pretty cool group of volunteers. I'm sure they're always looking for help. I know they added some people recently. So with that said, Jay, I'm going to turn this over to you. Jessica and I are going to turn off cameras here, so you're going to be the main show here. And when you're done, I'm going to hop back on, wrap it up. So if people have questions along the way, hit up the Q&A. Jay will get to them at the end, or myself, or Jessica, or somebody will be moderating them. You can be active in the chat. That's all cool. But yeah, Jay, this is all you. Welcome.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the introduction. Can you guys hear me? Just quick sound check here.
Yeah, we got you. I got you.
All right,
You're good.
awesome. I'm going to share my presentation. John, if you don't mind, just let me know if you can see my screen here.
You're good, Jay. We got you.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending this presentation. I'm really excited to share some of the insights into the best practices, like John mentioned. The goal of this presentation is essentially to share some of the insight into the best practices committee, the work they have done over the last few years on the team, the collateral, the documentation that the team has produced. And I'm hoping that this session today will provide you some key takeaways from a best practices standpoint. Full disclosure, I did share this presentation at the Tech Summit last month, so some of it could be repetitive for some of the folks who attended my session there at the Tech Summit. What I have done is taken some feedback from that session and added a few more slides onto this. So hopefully there is some new collateral there and content that might be useful to you guys who have seen this presentation before. All right, so let's jump into this right away. Let's talk a little bit about the specification, definition of specification versus the best practices, and talk a little bit about what the difference is, and kind of lay the foundation from that side. Specifications defines the mechanism and the payload structure around an API. It essentially tells you how the API is structured. It's kind of like a blueprint of a house. On the other hand, best practices speaks to the qualitative usability of the contents of those structure. It gives you the information on how to best optimize the efficiency and the effectiveness of a specified protocol or an API. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper by taking an example and highlighting the differences between both of them. So here, for example, we're looking at a product data 2.0. We're choosing the color name. This is the marketing color name, Sand Dollar. And if you see the bottom there, the snippet from the color object in that product data 2.0 specification, you can see the color name is mandatory and rest of the fields are optional. So if a supplier chooses to send the color name Sand Dollar in this case in the specifications to the end user, that information in essence in isolation is not really valuable, right? However, if they choose to send, let's say, a hex color code, which is a unique value associated with that color name, that then becomes really valuable to the end user, to the designers or the developers who are going to consume that information and display that color swatch on the front end side. Also, in addition to that, if there are multiple suppliers who are using either the same color name or a variation of that color name, let's say, instead of Sand Dollar, they're using Desert Tan or Khaki or Brown now, and also sending the hex color code in the response, then it becomes really valuable information for the end user to then consume that information, build that common database around that color name by using the hex color code. And that, in essence, will be kind of the difference between meeting the specification versus providing the best practices and the value add to that end user there. There are two main goals from a best practices committee standpoint that we've been tasked to accomplish. So first is developing the documentation that is complementary to Promo standard specifications to help suppliers better understand when something is desired, even if it is not required. Again, the goal here is from a best practices standpoint to share the documentation for both suppliers and distributors to enhance the user experience. It is really critical to understand that just meeting the specifications is not going to get the desired results. If you need a higher level of interaction, you have to go beyond meeting the specifications and essentially follow the best practices. Number two goal is to develop implementation recommendations that help both suppliers and distributors build successful and productive integration. Again, these recommendations are geared towards both suppliers and distributors and benefit from them. Just to be clear, the best practices committee is not there to enforce these recommendations, but generally encourage and guide the distributors and suppliers to consume these best practices and benefit from them. Let's dig into a little bit deeper into the best practices, taking an example of a Promo Standards Media API call. So here in this example, if you see, the requester is asking for a class type 1006, which is a primary image. And they are asking for a primary image for part ID P171 in color blue. And if you see on the right-hand side here, the sender, the supplier in this case, chooses to send a group shot and emphasizing the color purple pan. And then on the background, you have the blue and the other colors. So essentially, the best practice recommendation there is to send a single shot, a decorated and a non-decorated shot, which is essentially highlighting the decoration for the end user. So it's really valuable for the end user to see how the decoration is applied on the pen. So whether it's on the front of the pen, the side of the pen, or the decoration is wrapped around the pen. So that is really valuable information there. Also, we recommend to share as many image shots as possible. So for example, on the apparel side, there's a lot of value for distributors or decorators to see the flat image shots and the side shots rather than the model shots. So it just depends on, what your distributors or your customers are looking for from that perspective. Other best practices recommendation, do not use the supplier repository as a CDN, download the media locally and this copy for internal use or on your website. Essentially helpful for both suppliers and distributors, right? And the distributor side, it improves your performance, improves your page rendering and loading times for your end user. If you have a local repository, so just do one pull from the supplier and then create a local database on your end to render that information. And on the supplier side, obviously, it improves the performance if you're not hitting them real time when a user is on your website and trying to access a certain piece of metadata related to the product or the media. Leverage image resizing services, software to get media to the dimensions that are required. Again, different distributors may have different image resolution needs. So if the supplier is sending a standard image resolution in the media call, you can use other third-party software services like Kraken.io, Image Graphics, other softwares available, so you can resize that image to your unique needs. Ignore size variations when returning images. This is especially true for on the apparel side, because, for example, for Sanmar, we have a lot of products with a lot of size variations and color variations. So if you look at the payload, it could become heavy if you're not ignoring the size variations. So in order to minimize and alleviate the payload in the response, you would want to make sure that you're ignoring the size variation, just looking at the color and the associated image and sending that information back to the end user. And at the bottom, there's a link to our collateral. I will talk a little bit more about where our collateral is hosted and share that access to you guys at the end of the presentation. Here's an example again from a best practices standpoint, highlighting the API overuse. If you see on the top graph here, you can see requester making around 1,600 product data API requests per minute. And in this example, the supplier has chosen to implement rate limits on their platform, and they're essentially throttling the number of calls that are being placed on their platform. So in this case, if you can see, out of the roughly 1,600 API calls, roughly 100 have passed through and gotten a successful response, and around rest of the 1,500 it either ended up in a spike arrest or a coda arrest, which essentially this is simulating is a DDoS attack on a supplier. And so the challenges in this scenario are, it's not just the requester that is ending up getting a lot of failed calls, but it's also impacting the broader customer base for the supplier, because if any other customer is making other calls on the platform at the same time, they're not getting the response because they're getting bombarded by these calls. So the best practices here is essentially to make sure that you are working with your suppliers and understanding how often their product data is updated, how should you optimize your product data workflow, For example, for Sanmar, we update product data twice a year with a staggered approach. We have some smaller updates, every couple of months. So we generally recommend making product data calls once a month, and making sure that your product data is up to date. And so that's kind of the best practices from that standpoint. In the bottom left image, kind of the similar scenario, the requester is pulling around 6,000 images per minute, and you can see the performance impact there on the supplier system when they're receiving that many calls in a short span of time. Another example of a API overviews from an order status and OSN standpoint. This is kind of a real life example from a supplier where they were getting hit by around 3,500 failed order status calls per day. And when they started digging into the audit logs and started analyzing the data, they realized that the customer in this use case scenario were there were a couple of issues. One, they were sending invalid PO numbers in the calls, so they were failing. And the other big reason was that as soon as they place the order, they start making order status calls for those POs within 5 minutes. And then when the supplier reached out to the customer and collaborated with them, they realized that for the supplier, on the supplier side, the data gets updated after around 30 minutes to an hour. And then only can they consume the data from order status from the reporting database. So it became evident that they had to optimize their workflow on the customer side. So then they collaborated and updated their workflow. And as you can see at the bottom right here, around some time frame in January, the number of failed calls started dipping in. The other key takeaway from this use case scenario was to essentially highlight the order status and OSN calls to work in tandem. So if you're sending an order status call, you want to make sure you're looking at the status. So if it is partially shipped or complete, you then want to loop your OSN calls and pull the appropriate data for that PO number or for that sales order number that you're making a call for. Here is another example, kind of a real life example from a supplier around the inventory and product pricing config API overuse. On the left-hand side, you can see roughly around around January timeframe this year, around 35,500 failed calls that the customers were making on a supplier platform. And after digging into the audit logs and analyzing the data, the supplier quickly realized that the customer was essentially sending either invalid product IDs, meaning that they were no longer valid. They were either closeouts or they were phased out of the supplier system, and also they were choosing to essentially they were using product IDs from a different supplier, so they were not sending that product ID to the right supplier, as well as they were connecting their sandbox systems to the supplier production system. So they were pushing data or making calls from the sandbox system, which was not up to date. So essentially best practice there, the supplier worked with the end user customer there and helped them re-optimize their design. They started by getting the product data from get sellable API call, and then they essentially tag that and loop that with the get product data modified. So essentially build that product management database on their end. And as you can see at the end of January, the number of failed calls started decreasing significantly due to that. Similar scenario on the right-hand side here on the pricing and config call here, you can see the number of failed calls around 10,000 per day for this unique use case scenario. And after the supplier started digging into the details from the audit logs, they realized that the customer was essentially sending invalid product IDs, and so they started working with the customer to re-optimize their design around that PPC to make sure that they have the most up-to-date product IDs and part IDs in their system. And once that happened, they could see the number of calls started drastically going down after that re-optimization of their workflow. This slide can talks about some of the distributor best practices from the API overuse front. So number one, minimize real-time use of API. So inventory, order status, OSN, and purchase order API. So essentially, let's take an example of an inventory API. So we recommend that you use the inventory API as part of your purchase order workflow. So you're planning to place an order. You want to make sure that whatever items are in your cart, you make real-time API calls at that time. The other use case scenario would be if you want to pull the product inventory for the entire product catalog, you want to make sure you're using the product ID instead of the part ID. So I can give you an example of our SanMar. We have over 135,000 SKUs in our database. So if you make a part ID call, that would be 135,000 calls just one time to run through that cycle. So we recommend making the call at the product ID. It will make your payload, our payload, a little bit heavier. But that's always better than individually making that many calls. So that's the recommendation from that side. Order status and OSN, want to make sure, again, depending on the supplier order processing workflow. Give an example of SanMar, we recommend 2 to 3 times making that call per day. And also making sure that you are keeping an eye on the order status facet, and making sure that when you receive the status of partially shipped or complete, then you start looping in the OSN call and start getting the relevant data based on that info. Caching the data locally wherever possible, it makes everyone's lives easier and the experience faster. So essentially, you don't need to make the product data calls every day to fetch product metadata from the supplier. Just build a local database and your product management database, and you can render that information locally, whether it's related to product data or media or pricing information. Add a delay per API request for any that are batched together. This essentially relates to if there are any developers who are listening to this presentation. We recommend that if you're going to batch the API calls together, either try to wait for the call to complete and then send the next call, or put a few hundred milliseconds of delay in each call. So you want to make sure that there is enough space for the call for the supplier to process the call and send you the information back. And it really helps if you put that delay, even if it is a few hundred milliseconds of delay, really helpful and easier on the supplier system as well. Try to avoid asking suppliers to repurpose fields in the API. I know there are times where if you're working with a customer, that there could be a service where a key piece of metadata is, that you need as a distributor may not be available through that standard. We recommend reaching out to the standards committee and to best practices committee through Slack. Share your use case scenario, and we're happy to hear and possibly provide recommendations on that use case scenario to address that gap. Do not submit configured POs with URLs to password protected artwork. Again, this goes back to the fact to our goal in Promo Standards is to be as seamless and have minimal touch points as much as possible, and minimal human intervention. So any type of password protected information where the supplier has to go back to the distributor to ask for that creates more touch points and potentially PO or order processing delays. So we recommend either not having that password protected, or if you're going to have password protected, share that password through other mechanisms up front, so the supplier has that information when they're ready to process your order. Here are a few best practices for suppliers as well. So suppliers need to pay close attention to the quality of data being passed back in the APIs. A lot of times there's a strong temptation when the suppliers are building against new service to just pass the validation, meet the specifications of all the mandatory fields and call it good and call the API complete. The best practices recommendation is to essentially make sure that you're working upfront with a small group of heavy users, your trusted customers who are going to use this service and get feedback from them as you're building this service and beta testing with them. You want to make sure you are enriching the data in that service as much as possible so your end users can benefit from them. The other best practices there is do not assume everyone knows your maintenance windows or rate limits. Document in an integration guide. Really valuable to have a robust technical integration guide available for your customers. Share as much information as you have around rate limits, throttling, maintenance windows, your product data updates, your order status updates. How often do you update order status? How often do you update pricing, product data? How often do you update invoicing? So have that information up front so the distributor or your customer who is building against your service has all that information so they can accurately design their solution up front rather than at some point going live and then running into some issues at that time. And then using a CDN that gives you image caching and rate limiting tools. Again, this goes back to the point that I was mentioning in a couple of slides before. It speeds up the process of loading time and image delivery. So it's really helpful from that front. So look for those solutions that are out there where they have image caching and rate limiting abilities. So this slide talks about the general rollout strategy. Both apply to both suppliers and distributors. You can choose to go down the transactional path, start with the inventory, order status, OSN, or the non-transactional path where you can go down first to the media and then the product data. Again, the goal is for newer suppliers or distributors new to Promo Standards, try to learn from a simpler schema. So get your feet wet, start with the simpler services that a Promo Standard offers, and then eventually deep dive into some of the more complicated services like product pricing config, and then eventually that will feed into the purchase order spec when you guys are ready. So that's the goal there and the best practice recommendation. Always beta test and soft release your service before going live. So essentially, like I was saying in the previous slide, make sure you have a trusted group of beta testers, your customers who are heavy users on your platform, who understand their unique needs and how they're going to use your service. So make sure that you are going through a beta test, work with those customers, address any bug fixes, any metadata that they may need that you're not providing today. So address all those use scenarios up front before you go live and share your endpoint on Promo Standards side. Sizing the right technology, really critical in terms of if you have a long-term roadmap of adopting Promo Standards, you look at the services that you're going to offer, you look at the payload based on, let's say, your product data, right? You want to look at your payload in the product data and see how heavy it is. You want to make sure you're using the right technology platform, right? That can sustain long-term down the line. So you want to make sure that you're investing in the right technology infrastructure upfront. And then rate limiting and setting upfront expectations are really helpful. If you have a robust technical guide, you're sharing all that information upfront around whether it's rate limits, whether it's how do you do your testing? What kind of sandbox do you have for your distributors, customers to test against? Maintenance schedules, right? If there are scheduled maintenance every week, every month, so make sure that information is provided up front. Your product data updates, your order status updates, how often do you update that information? So all of that information, the more documentation you have available to your customers, the better it is. And I will share, we have some collateral as well available on our best practices site from some suppliers that you can consume as well. And then lastly, audit logs are really helpful. If you have audit logs available and build that capability on your platform, it can essentially you can see if there is one OSN call on that platform, you can see that that's one less phone call to an account executive. The other benefits also include, you can help you troubleshoot issues with your customers. You can look at trends and patterns, a lot of information that you can guide. Some of the use case scenarios that I shared in the previous slide around looking at the audit logs and gathering the data and working with customers to re-optimize their workflow, that's all coming from the audit log. So you want to make sure that you have the audit logs available to be able to do that data analysis and looking at trends and patterns from that perspective. Tools to assist this, essentially what I was talking about, where our best practices collateral is hosted today. So if you go to promostandards.org and you go to the resources tab and then you click on the Promo Standards best practices, it will take you to an Atlassian wiki page. And you can see the best practices homepage, and then you have two sections there, mainly the distributor home, and then you have the supplier section. The distributor have integration strategies that you'll have a lot more information that than I shared today in the presentation. There's a lot of good information there that I would recommend distributors to go through that, who are building, who are new to building their services or in the process of building against Promo Standards endpoints. On the supplier side, we have supplier templates. So these are integration guides that different suppliers have built that talk about some of the things that I mentioned in the last slide. They will talk about, their endpoints, their rate limits, their throttling, their maintenance schedules. All of that information is there. I think today we have the templates from Alpha Broder, Kuzi Group, and Sanmar, and we're adding more templates from other suppliers who have them. So if you don't have, as a supplier, if you don't have those integration guides, we'll highly recommend reviewing those, and maybe you can build your own supplier guide. That will be really helpful for your customers. And then supplier technical integration strategies kind of talks about if you're new to building a service on Promo Standards. These are some helpful tips, some recommendations, some how-tos, lots of information there on how to build against Promo Standards services. And then at the bottom there, the endpoint with best practices fields identified. So this is basically what our team does, is goes through each of the services that are live and provides a best practices recommendation. So essentially, if you go to that page, you will have, listed, you have order status, you have PO 1.0, you have media calls. So our team has gone through, and we have a experienced group of suppliers, distributors, third-party service providers that have a lot of experience using these services and in the industry. So we have provided best practices on each of those services that you guys can consume. And again, this is the Promo Standards Validator, API Validator. Just to be clear, this is not a best practices validator, but this allows you to, as a new supplier or a distributor, you can key your endpoint and you can run your service, and essentially tells you whether you're meeting the schema, right? And you validate against that service. So really helpful tool still. But again, it's not a best practice validator, but it will give you a lot of information, and will make sure your schema is correct, you're using the right namespace, all of that information from a technical standpoint. So highly recommend, if you're new to Promo Standards or you're building your service, to run your service through this validator to make sure you're meeting you're passing the validation before you go live with your endpoint. Upcoming milestones from Best Practices Committee. So far, we have completed the best practices guidelines and recommendations for product data 2.0, media 1.1, and order status 1.0. And then right now we're working on purchase order 1.0. And we're hoping that we'll be able to complete that in the next month or so. Again, the ones that have been completed, we're always looking for new feedback. So if there is, you guys go and look at that information, and if there is feedback, we're always open to feedback. And these are live documents, so we'll, if necessary, we'll go back and update those documentation from a best practices standpoint. And the rest of the services, our goal is to, we're gonna go through each one of those, and hopefully by the end of this year, our goal is to complete the best practices for all of those services. And lastly, I would like to highlight the members of the committee who have volunteered their time and shared their expertise over the last few years. They've been really instrumental in building the best practices repository and providing guidance here. And thank you everybody for listening to this presentation today. Let's see. Any questions? Comments anybody wants to share? Any best practices experience that they have adopted recently? I'm open to
All right. So the way we can try this is there's a few questions. I want to address one or two of them. If you have a question that you want to go on record and not be anonymous, like anonymous attendees been hammering the Q&A, raise your hand if you have an actual question, and Jessica can promote you to panelists if you want to go, on record here. So while that's happening, so there's a question in there. Any recommendations to discontinue products? What happens to a data set when a supplier drops a product? So this is an interesting one, right? Because what happens in practice? When we not close out, let's just say it's done with its closeout lifespan. So right, a typical product goes from supplier world new to this post new world where it sits on their website for a number of years. Somebody finally decides that it's old or it's running out of stock or it's not available anymore and goes to close out till the inventory is done. And then all of a sudden one day it just disappears, right? Somebody in their marketing or product data team just goes and turns it off and it disappears for good. The problem with that in a promo standards world is that all of a sudden you're getting product sellable every day and there's, call it 100 products that come back. And then the next day there's 99 products that came back and one of them just doesn't come back anymore. So if you're looking to update your data, you're going to make one of the assumptions that there's no updates on this product because there's nothing there. So that is a challenge. I don't think the best solution is to leave them if they're not available. I guess it's more of an implementation challenge of in product data, there's a get product sellable. I think if you can pass into that is end of line or is closeout, I think it's one of the parameters in there. I would say one of the sanity checks every month or so has to be go through that is product sellable and validate that your is product sellable. The products that you have in your PIM are still quote unquote sellable by that supplier. We talked about, I know when these standards we talked about the scenario when these standards were being developed, and that came up of, unfortunately, we don't tell you, as me speaking as a supplier, we don't tell you that in 3 weeks I'm going to drop this product. It just literally disappears from my data. So the easiest thing today is to use that get product sellable functionality because it's very lightweight. It just returns a bunch of product IDs and hard IDs. I think the bigger challenge is knowing how suppliers manage their data is we don't always just delete products, we delete parts, right? So in Jay's case, he might delete the 3X of the pink shirt, but keep the 2X around, right? So you're gonna have to look at that part level details to know, because I think color additions in this industry are very common and color subtractions. So I would just say the more you can build that get product sellable functionality into your workflow, the better. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, yeah, that's definitely I think that's a good use case scenario to work with your suppliers. And like you said, John, different suppliers are a different way to manage product data and product data lifecycle. So I can give an example of Sanmarla, for example. We have, our we go through the product life cycle, like you said, we go through new, active, regular, discontinued, closeout. And you're right. I mean, we do a combination of inventory and the product status. And when the inventory drops up to a certain level, then we remove that product. And yes, there is no end date. It's a combination of where we see the inventory drop, and then we just stop displaying that product to the end user. So there is that kind of subjectiveness in terms of you have to.
Unfortunately, it's managed in the industry.
Yeah.
Oh, you were good. We got it. That makes sense. for feedback, so Mike Schmidt's asking a question. Is it best to just post best practice in the Slack channel? I guess, Jay, how do your committee want to gather best practices from the community? Is there a preferred mechanism for how to get them to you and to your group? And, you know,
yeah, the best practices, the Slack channel is the best way. I'm happy to, if there is a lot of feedback that sometimes Slack might not be the best way, email me the feedback and I will make sure that we review that with the team. The more concrete the feedback, the better it is for us to make sure that we understand what the feedback is about, and we can, obviously reach out to the end user and set up a call or whatever and follow up and make sure we're gathering the right information and addressing that feedback. So yeah, either Slack, that's kind of the best way, is easier and quicker. Or if there's a lot of feedback, just shoot me an email.
Awesome. All right, next one, and I'll take this one and give you a breather here, Jay. So Bill Harris, how do suppliers return negotiated contracted pricing or something PS supports? Yes, we very much do support this. So in the product pricing configuration service, there are 3 different pricing parameters that you can pass into the request. And I'm going to just do this by memory, and I could be wrong. One's catalog, net maybe, and customer. That customer price parameter that you pass in the product pricing configuration is the one you want. So what that is that's the negotiated price. Now you have to, if you're a distributor, you obviously are querying with your own credentials. If you're a service provider, this is the reason why you need to provide query with that distributor's credentials to get that specific distributor's pricing on those products. So my guidance that I recommend when we do implementations, and I'm sure Jay will take this up with his committee, is let's say you have 100 products, 50 of them have negotiated pricing and 50 don't. So for the 50 that have negotiated pricing, when they pass in customer, return those prices. And if it's a non-negotiated price product, return the net price. Don't return the catalog price, because it's implied and assumed that the customer price is the actual net price, not the catalog web-friendly display price. So that's something we can clarify in a best practices document. But so yes, the short answer there is Promo Centers does support it in the PPC request with that pricing parameter. That's one of the 3 parameters, which is enumerated in the documentation. Okay, Steve Nadeau, thank you everybody for not going anonymous anymore. That does me well. As a manufacturer, what's the best practices regarding inventory? We're building custom promotional products. We don't have real inventory. All right, when we do this one, Jay, I can do this one. All right, so in inventory 2.0, so this was a big inventory 1.2, 1.0, whatever you want to call it. This was a big fallacy in 1.2, and the BIC, which is now Koozie Group, obviously had beef with this, and we ultimately corrected this. Manufacturers didn't have a way to convey that this product is manufactured. We added a data field in the response of product of inventory service 2.0, saying that this is, I think it's called is manufactured or something. You essentially return that product as true. And because what was happening before is they were putting in values like 1 million or some ridiculous values that were just throwing a lot of people's data off. So now if you essentially respond back that this is a manufactured item, the assumption is that within reason, you can make whatever you need whenever you need them, and that supersedes the inventory. Some people were using that in conjunction with, I have 50,000 on the floor, but I can manufacture this, so therefore my inventory is in the future is unlimited. But the guidance there is that we addressed that in inventory 2.0 where it wasn't really addressed before. Mark, you're going to have a question that you're going to ask live, and Jay and I are going to try to answer it live. So no pressure. What you got? And I like the dolphin picture. I'm assuming that's a dolphin, maybe a sea lion. Oh, Mark went away. That's too bad. All right, Mark, if you had a question, you can always answer it in Q&A. Anything else? All right. All right, Ajay, thank you very much. You did an awesome job. It was great to not have to do these, and we might be calling on you in the future to do more education sessions. But yeah, you did a great job. Like I said, promo standards, best practices committee is a very important part of what we're doing here. It allows us to, as you saw, provide that additional guidance where a field and a definition might not go the whole way. So if you have interest in these types of things, reach out to Ajay as a committee chair. He can get you either plugged in on the committee, plugged into a work group. You saw what their marching orders are in the order of the standards that they're going to attack. So if you have a passion about one of those standards and best practices, or happen to be implementing them along the way and want to, get your hands dirty a little bit, this is a great place to do it, right? This is where the implementation, kind of, what do I do here? Questions get answered. So, awesome. Before I let everybody go, remember, third Tuesday of every month, next month, Stephen Stanley is going to hammer down OSN 2.0, do a deep dive walkthrough of that. We'll do some live responses, requests, all that fun stuff to show you exactly what you're in for, and kind of why we made a pivot from OSN 1.0. So that said, thank you, everybody. Ajay, any parting words?
No, thank you so much, John, for providing this platform and opportunity to share some of the insights from the best practices committee. Looking forward to any feedback. Hit us up on Slack or email me. Always happy to hear. Thank you.
All right. Great job, Ajay. Crushed it.
See ya. Thank you, everybody.